please. So, Andrew Cox, General Manager of International Markets, Meat and Livestock Australia. The industry operates in a global marketplace. Our next speaker, Andrew, is going to share some insights in what our customers and competitors are up to. As General Manager of International Markets and for Meat and Livestock Australia, Andrew is responsible for promoting Australian beef, lamb and goat meat overseas. This includes managing the in-market jointly funded by the in-market team, jointly funded by LiveCorp through the Live Export program. Before we welcome Andrew on stage, I'd like to just mention a great thanks to the MLA team for their support of LIVEXchange as a sponsor and beyond that with logistics. They do that not only this year, but since we first started holding conferences nearly a decade ago. So, Andrew, thank you, and very proud to have MLA as part of it and you in your capacity to address the conference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry, and g'day everyone. A few less people than the keynote speaker section, but just a reminder: if you're not in this section, you don't get any of the lamb that Sammy Burke, our corporate chef, is breaking down. So more the merrier for those that are still in the room. I'm quite new to the live export side of our program. I've been working for MLA for 20 years, but until now in marketing side on box meat. But we've recently had a reshuffle, so this is my debut at the conference. Glad to hear that Terry, you're thankful for previous sponsorship. Really excited to be here because livestock export remains a critical component of Australia's agricultural trade. And I think it's a sentiment that's been expressed a couple of times already this morning. And because it's not purely a commercial activity, it's also a bridge to markets where culture, logistics and consumer preferences mean chilled and frozen imports are very much imperfect substitutes to that live trade. So I'll run through a little bit of the trade data, trade dynamic, MLA/LiveCorp's live export program, where we have people, and then just my thoughts on where protein markets are heading and the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for our industry. So Australia's the fourth largest exporter of live cattle, although of course most of the world's live cattle transactions take place across a shorter distance and across a land border. And of course, a lot of those crossings are, we could say, fairly imperfectly recorded transactions. But as far as the data, as we can read on the data, we're the fourth largest exporter of live cattle. We export cattle to 16 countries, mostly of course in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia and Vietnam, and total value is nearly $1 billion Australian dollars. Putting that in perspective, the only boxed meat markets that approach $1 billion are the big four markets of United States, China, Japan and Korea. And in total, around 15% of our total bovine imports are exported in the live form. So, and in those two key livestock markets, by which I mean Indonesia and Vietnam for cattle, live exports represent in fact, the larger component of our meat and livestock trade. So as you can see on the slide there, 61% of our bovine exports to Indonesia and 72% to Vietnam are in live form. So in those two markets particularly, we constitute in the live export sector a key part of the protein import demand in cattle and beef. And in fact, if you just take Indonesia as an example, Australian cattle represented on this chart in orange contributes around 20% of Indonesia's entire beef consumption. So that's despite the emergence of competition from low-cost competitors, Indian buffalo meat, Brazilian beef, increased imports of boxed beef, of course. Indonesia has actually remained very consistent over time, obviously ups and downs politically, supply, etc., price, but generally speaking, Indonesia's, as a livestock export market, has remained extremely consistent over time. And I was asked just to take a quick look at competition, because competition is always supremely important, of course, for long-term success of any sector. And since 2018, Indian buffalo meat's been quite topical, of course. It's got a 100,000 tonne quota into Indonesia. However, the volumes to Southeast Asia have actually, which is seen there in blue, have actually decreased in favour of the Middle Eastern markets, and that's due to strong demand from the Middle East, of course proximity and smoother access as well to those markets in the Middle East. Looking at Brazil, Indonesia's reportedly looking to Brazil to help deliver, and their 17 million dairy cattle of course, to help increase local milk and beef production, but as yet no live shipments have been recorded from Brazil, which obviously is a long way away, 30 to 40 days transit. But it should be noted that Brazil now has achieved FMD-free status. There's protocols being developed, and Brazil is being looked at, as mentioned earlier, as a future consistent trading partner with Indonesia to help deliver on the example of the school programs, etc. So it's certainly something to watch going forward in terms of competition. Let's take a look at sheep meat. Australia is a smaller player on the global sheep trade, live sheep trade, less than 2% of global trade volume last year, much less than the larger players such as Sudan and Somalia and a host of other countries in Africa and Europe. However, as mentioned earlier, our disease-free status, our quality livestock, all make us a highly regarded source and a preferred supplier of sheep animals by live transit. Of course, the Middle East and North Africa is the key market and key region for live sheep and goat exports globally. And I think it's often assumed that Middle Eastern markets, and I think I've seen it in the press even in the last few years with the argument about live exports from Australia, it's assumed that Middle East markets are very rapidly evolving from live sheep markets to boxed meat markets with the development of sophisticated modern retail chains, etc. But this data shows me that that's absolutely not necessarily the case. So you can see here the yellow line on this chart shows the percentage of ovine imports to Middle East that are boxed and versus live, and the yellow line represents live imports. As you can see, it's been steady between 40 and 50% for the last 15 years or so. And in fact, it's actually increased slightly since 2018. So I think the sort of factoid that the Middle East doesn't want live animals is not correct. What's happened though is that Australia's share of sheep livestock imports to the Middle East has plunged, and as that's the green line there, you can see that we've been replaced in the last 15 years by sheep from elsewhere. Okay, let's move on to the live export program. Firstly, I'm sure most of you in the room are aware, but not all of you, so it doesn't hurt to remind that MLA is a service provider, not a policy or advocacy body for industry, who in that case of live export would be the Australian Live Exporters Council, who of course are here. MLA, as a service provider, maintains a network of 60 staff across 17 international locations. So we divide regionally into 5 regions, each represented by a regional manager, who with their team will represent industry position to overseas customers, to overseas governments, and of course directly to overseas consumers. We also maintain dedicated live export and market access managers in Jakarta, in Hanoi, and in Dubai. And some of those people are here today, and not to mention other staff have come from Sydney, Brisbane, etc. So we're next door. If you haven't ducked over already, please do so at lunchtime or during the breakout sessions. We have 6 or 7 staff here who are very keen to have a chat with producers and exporters. Oops. Oh, there we go, yeah. So the 3 focus areas of the livestock export program are animal welfare, supply chain efficiency, and market access insights. Without animal welfare assurance, the trade simply does not exist. So it's been the #1 focus since day dot. This program area consists of hands-on education and training in market of thousands of frontline staff in animal handling, in stunning, biosecurity, and loading-unloading techniques. Secondly, as we operate in a global marketplace with much competition, we focus on supply chain efficiencies to build competitiveness, such as working to improve ruminant nutrition, reducing feed costs, improving eating quality, packaging and distribution, etc. And thirdly, our international market staff capture market insights from their overseas locations. That feeds back down through industry channels, informs strategy, commercial decision-making, supports crisis management, highlights trade threats, provides strategic support to government and industry. Lastly, we partner 50-50 with Australian exporters on co-funded market development programs. And I should note at this point that we're continuing to support the sheep live export sector with the same budget and the same resources that we have done all the way through, and maintain our full-time position, Amanda, who's here actually, in Dubai, and also ramping up marketing on boxed meat to try and help industry transition. So some of you may have been aware we hosted our ambassadors in the West just 6 weeks ago. We had 20 international chefs here to learn about our sheep industry supply chain and our wonderful food scene here in Western Australia. Right, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on where protein markets are heading. Firstly, you wouldn't be able to escape this, but protein is the hottest trend in food right now. After a fairly long few decades of being the whipping boy in nutrition, and I note we have a nutritionist tomorrow. I look forward to your presentation. But certainly from my read on international markets and Australia as well, there's a much reduced fear of animal fats. There's an increased recognition of the role that nutrient-dense red meat plays in healthy diets, and there's certainly been increased scrutiny in the highly processed foods sector, such as fake meat, to the point where I think we'll look back, or we're already looking back at the food pyramids from the 90s, which put processed cereals above meat and produce as a comical hallucination from the food industry. So we're in a good space on the role of protein and the role of red meat in a healthy diet. And to let you know what that means in terms of demand, it's a fairly busy slide, sorry, but I'll try and simplify it for you. In all markets, of course, there's an inverse relationship between the price of meat and the per capita consumption of that product. So you can see here the green dots. That's for the United States of America. For the last 20 years, whenever the price rises, the consumer will eat less beef. But you'll see the orange dots, and this is allowed for inflation as well. So it's data coming out of Len Steiner, one of the best ag economists in the US. The orange dots represent the last 6 years. So you can see effectively since COVID, and I think COVID was a catalyst for people to reevaluate their diets, you'll see that consumers in some ways have actually broken the historical relationship between price and volumes, and they're paying more for beef and they're eating more of the product at the same time. That's one example from the US, which was just good quantitative data that I could pick up. But we're seeing this trend in many, many markets. Demand for red meat globally is extremely hot, not just in developing countries, but also in developed nations. Consumers are bearing with price increases and still maintaining a central role for red meat in their diets. So I think that's a really great positive, which sometimes is overlooked because of the focus on developing markets. And of course, I'm about to focus on developing markets as well with my second point. The second thing I want to note, and it's been noted all the way through this morning's sessions and no doubt will be through tomorrow as well, it's economic growth in Southeast Asia and the opportunities that creates for anyone in Australian agriculture, but particularly those who are in export exposure to Southeast Asia. We've got a tremendous opportunity on our doorstep. The number of affluent middle-class consumers are set to approximately double by 2030. In Southeast Asia, countries such as Indonesia, such as Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, all growing fast, and anyone who's been up to the region will be struck by the number of young consumers, the explosion in infrastructure in cities, metros, trains, buses, road networks, the explosion in food service outlets, in retail, etc. Malls, mall development, tourism development is quite astounding for Australians who are probably used to a more sedate pace of development. So it's a tremendous opportunity for our industry because we know that as markets develop and as economies grow and consumers develop a little more wealth, then they instantly start looking to include more red meat into their diet for their family health and enjoyment. And it's that economic growth that's already been driving a 9% average annual increase in exports to Southeast Asia in the last 15 years. That's in boxed and in live. But I did want to also, from my perspective today, potentially dispel a widely held belief, which I hear all the time, I live in Singapore, that gets bandied about quite easily, which is that as markets mature in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East, then wet markets will naturally somehow cease to exist. But from my experience, that couldn't be further from the truth. And once again, anyone who's travelled around Asia would know that wet markets thrive in all kinds of markets, no matter what stage of development they're at, because of cultural and religious reasons. So I would really challenge this thought that as markets grow and develop, the wet markets will disappear in favour of modern retail and supermarkets. So I think Singapore is a good example because Singapore is an extremely wealthy small island in Southeast Asia, but it developed from pretty humble beginnings. And wet markets were definitely part of that operation from day dot. So you can see on this slide, 100 years ago, fairly rudimentary wet markets were established near the docks or in street stalls with pretty poor sanitary standards. Later, with the population boom post-war in Singapore, the 1950s and 60s, and then into the 1980s, modern wet markets were established and proliferated all the way through the island. And with that came national standards, sanitary monitoring by the local authorities, etc., and consumers adopted certain habits of convenience that were aligned with their culture and their need for fresh food. Since then, of course, in Singapore and in many other markets, Hong Kong and Malaysia and many markets, these wet markets have come under severe pressure from modern international supermarket chains, but they have not disappeared. In fact, they've more or less held their own, much the same as the butcher channel in Australia, which are like mini wet markets in a way. They haven't thrived necessarily, but they've survived because of their ingenuity and their ability to provide something different. So today, Singapore, once again, a very small island, has over 100 wet markets, and the stallholders are probably not what they don't look necessarily like they used to. They're embracing online sales techniques, TikTok, Instagram videos, specials, and they're staying relevant to today's consumer. So I think that same situation can apply to many other wealthier Asian countries. I lived in Japan for some time. People still shop every day for fresh produce in mini wet markets in Japan, in Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan and Malaysia, the so-called wealthier countries of Asia. So there's little to no evidence from my point of view that economic growth will threaten the existence of wet markets and therefore the key channel for live cattle to Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines. Okay, so have that rant over. To close, I've just noted a few challenges and opportunities that I see personally on the demand side for the live export sector. A challenge, of course, is that wet markets, despite what I just said, have lost some market share across Asia, particularly during COVID with the shift to online purchasing. And I would say, therefore, that to maintain market share and relevance, wet markets across Southeast Asia do need to evolve, looking at media forms and differentiation of their product, etc. Secondly, cheaper competition from sources such as Indonesia and Brazil do represent a growing and significant threat to any sector that's built on low price and commodity type spec. The wet market channel has traditionally provided less opportunity for product differentiation, marketing, although similar to my point one, I would argue that this is something that would likely change over time. And then over to opportunities. They're still remaining, and I think there's a lot of people in the room who could expand on these more than I can, but there are still remaining future live pathways in countries we heard about from the gents on stage before, Turkey, Morocco, Laos, China, etc. Secondly, all countries in the Asia-Pacific region, all countries, have strategic goals to increase food security and increase local food production, all countries. And that obviously lends itself well to a live export supply chain. As mentioned, economic growth in Asia and what that means for our industry. Also, of course, popularity of protein, which I just mentioned. And lastly, this is a bigger topic, but I think as I was sort of getting at before, I believe that consumers in Asia and consumers in the Middle East will always value freshness, and there's still, therefore, some unmet opportunities to develop a diversified product range that can access not only wet markets, but retail, hotel, restaurant sectors, etc. So I think the future is bright. Demand for red meat protein is extremely strong, whether you're in the live trade or the box meat export trade. Industry's in a good position, albeit with a number of significant challenges. And I'll probably leave it there. Thanks very much.
That's a great summary. Thanks very much. Do you want to take any questions?
Oh, I can, yeah.
Are there any questions to Andrew? It's a very good summary of the market as he sees it. So anything further we want to tease out? Yeah, there is one here, Andrew.
Yep.
Yeah. Just grab a microphone.
Hi, I'm Liz Jackson, here from Curtin University. I've got an interest in agri-food supply chain systems. What's the next step for Australian goats? There was a lot of talk in the presentation about growing demand for red meat protein, and Australia, I understand, is the biggest exporter of goat meat in the world.
Yep.
What's the potential for product substitution in markets in our nearest neighbours that are culturally a bit more attuned to consuming goat meat than we are?
Yeah. So goat meat, by majority, heads to the United States in box form, and the Americans won't even know about it, but it's our largest market by far for goat meat. And generally heads to the southeast and the southwest for Hispanic consumers, tacos and things like that. And then it's popular, of course, in the Caribbean as well, traditionally for jerk curries and things like that. But yes, there's fantastic unmet need elsewhere: India, Malaysia. Korea's recently become a market of significance, the second biggest market for goat meat. I'm not sure about the live protocols and where they're at. You might have to come and talk to one of our team. But yeah, certainly I think there's tremendous opportunity for goat meat, which is actually in many markets favoured over sheep meat. Quite often they blur the names of these two animals, but goat meat performs really well in slow cooking, and consumers therefore value it. We didn't get any goat meat protocols in the latest India trade deal. There's only sheep meat, but looking, of course, for goat meat protocols with a more comprehensive deal. And, of course, looking for opportunities for goat meat domestically as well. I think we're massively underrepresented as an industry here in Australia. We have a large immigrant population from India and other parts of Asia who do like goat meat, but we just haven't managed to get it sort of up and racing in retail. So that's another focus.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, well, we might leave it there. Just once again, thank you very much, Andrew, for attending the conference and bringing that wealth of knowledge for us. So really appreciate you all being here.